Okay, sige. So I'll start with a quick recap of what we uh, sort of read through last week was clusters. So what are the key features of clusters? I'll just double check here. Here. This is not the one with notes. Cluster with notes. Order notes. Here we go. So on the screen should be seen. Makita ang screen share.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So also this should be in the canvas already, the video. Modules here. So video lecture on agglomeration. I'll just rename this to clusters. Clusters is the term used in the book. Clusters. Intro to clusters. So to recap, clusters are geographic concentrations of interconnected companies and institutions in a particular field. So one particular field or kanang business. So clusters can encompass an array of linked industries and other entities important to competition. So they can include suppliers of specialized inputs such as components, machineries, services, and providers of specialized infrastructure. So clusters can also include governmental and other institutions such as universities, standard setting agencies, think tanks, vocational training providers, and so on. So basically, why do companies cluster? So we have a section here, so it's not super highlighted here. That's why anyway, I'll just do it off the top of my head. So companies cluster because there's benefits in working together, like physically in proximity, because you have better communication, better coordination. Also, economically, there's what we call a phenomenon called the economies of scale. So when companies get large enough and produce a specific good, for example, fast food chains, they reduce the cost of their inputs, meaning like the chicken, the rice, and increase their sales. So there's less cost and more profit. So basically, it's more profitable for them to cluster. So that's why eventually successful businesses tend to cluster. So you see in Talamban, there's the sort of education cluster with University of San Carlos, the different high schools nearby. I forget their names, but there's that area of Talamban has a university cluster. In Fuente Osmeña, there's like a medical cluster with the different hospitals and the hospital schools. They're coming together in the Fuente area, and other places in Cebu you'll find, and maybe in your locality as well, different kinds of clusters. So what we want for our businesses in like urban planning for this class for economic development, we want our clusters to be or like our industries to be competitive, and clusters are a way to make our industries, our different groups competitive. So modern competition depends on productivity. So clusters are more productive than I guess the alternative of kind of scattered development, sort of connecting with what we were talking about this morning, where there are a lot of benefits to compact development. So this increase of productivity, not on, sorry, competition depends on productivity, not on access to inputs or the scale of individual enterprises. Productivity rests on how companies compete, not on particular fields, not on the particular fields they compete in. Let's see, companies can be highly productive in industry, shoes, agriculture, etc., if they employ sophisticated methods, use advanced technology, and offer unique products and services. All industries can employ advanced technology, and then all industries can be knowledge intensive. So The sophistication which companies compete in a particular location, however is strongly influenced by the quality of local business and the quality of the local business environment. So companies cannot employ advanced logistical techniques, for example, without high quality transportation infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So basically, clusters affect competition in three broad ways. First, by increasing productivity of companies in a based in that area. Second, by driving the direction and pace of innovation, which underpins future productivity growth. And third, by stimulating formation of new businesses, which expand and strengthen the cluster itself. So a cluster allows each member to benefit as if it had greater scale or as if it had joined with others formally without requiring it to sacrifice its flexibility, meaning it doesn't have to officially be a part of that institution or business, but just by locating next to it, they sort of form some kind of a sort of informal alliance. So clusters and productivity. So being part of cluster allows companies to operate more productively in sourcing inputs, accessing information, technology, etc. So, for example, with the fast food, like maybe the manager of Jollibee can like talk to the manager of McDonald's, and they can exchange information, even though they're competitors. Maybe they can find ways to work together and increase profits. So, but the highlighted what you call factors here is number one, better access to employees and suppliers. So when businesses or companies cluster, uh, they can tap into existing pools of specialized and experienced employees, thereby lowering their search and transaction costs in recruiting. So this means like, for example, you have, I guess for architecture and again, fast food, if you're located in a city, there's a higher chance for you to hire, um, let's say, educated employees. Whereas if you locate in rural areas, they will have less training, less education. So do you see this in cities and municipalities around the Philippines and around the world where the businesses, fast food, education, they tend to cluster in cities because that's where their target market is and also their employees and suppliers. Okay, let's see. The close informal relationships possible among companies in a cluster are often superior and are often a superior in arrangement. So this is in comparison with formal alliances with distant suppliers and what you call this formal alliances involving complex bargaining and governance problems. Okay. In many cases, clusters are also a better alternative to vertical integration. Compared with in-house units, outside specialists are often more cost-effective and responsive, not only in component production, but also in services such as training. Although extensive vertical integration may have once been the norm, a fast-changing environment can render vertical integration inefficient, ineffective, and inflexible. I'm also experiencing this in our firm as well. Well, not really my firm. I'm part of an architecture firm based in near the university, the old campus of San Carlos, that area, Colon area. Not really Colon area, but more, I don't know what that area is called, like Conquera area. That's the street. But I noticed that my bosses tend to hire what do you call this? People outside the company to collaborate with them instead of having it done like inside the company. For me as an example, I'm sort of like a collaborator and not really a full-time employee, basically contract work. I think for those in um, the field of architecture, I think most of us are architects. We have a few engineers. We contract the construction of the building because it's more beneficial for us as the architects and engineers and designers to have an expert in construction to actually construct the building. We are more on the design side, they are on the building side. So similar thing is happening here with clusters. So if we have, for example, a yeah, let's stick with the architecture firm. So They need architects, they need designers. So they will locate in an area, usually a city, where people are being trained in those fields. So if, for example, Cebu City didn't have architecture schools, architecture departments, then it would be very difficult to find a architecture firm in Cebu City. Next, clusters have access to specialized information. So, as I mentioned earlier, extensive market, technical, and competitive information accumulates within a cluster, and members have preferred access to it. So, sort of like networking, I think would be the most clear example. So, you only talk to the people you trust, and then if you trust them, you can share information, you can work together, and then you can become even more productive. Clusters also create complementaries. Complementaries are a host of linkages among cluster members, which result in a whole greater than the sum of its parts. The sum of its parts. In a typical tourism cluster, for example, the quality of a visitor's experience depends not only on the appeal of primary attraction, but also on the quality and efficiency of complementary businesses such as hotels, restaurants, shopping outlets, and transportation facilities. I would also like to point out that this goes hand in hand with the idea that urban planners and urban designers should be against urban sprawl, because urban sprawl is single use, clusters are highly dense and mixed use. So it's not just, I know I mentioned earlier, I just wanted to clarify now. If you have a medical cluster or a university cluster, it's not just purely um, medical or education based companies that cluster together in that group, but you also have for schools you have the school suppliers with the like where you buy your uh, papers, pens, photocopy, printing. That is also part of the cluster. And then for the medical cluster, you have also the schools that teach the medicine. You have maybe suppliers for their medical tools, and maybe also in another more indirect way, maybe the waste management also is a big part of the medical industry that isn't really much talked about. Like think about all the medical waste, the specialized waste that needs to be thrown properly. That's also another big problem here in Cebu. I don't think we handle our medical waste so much, but those are the key sort of benefits of clusters that I want to touch on before we move on to the next part. So again, clusters provide better access to employees and suppliers, specialized information, and finally they create complementaries. Let me see if there's anything else. Okay, clusters innovation, business foundation, birth and reach and decline. So this one are less important, but I just want to highlight those three factors for benefits of clustering. Okay. So now let's go to Motoyama's discussion or article about cluster theory. So this was published 2008. So what can clusters solve and what can clusters not solve, basically? Hmm. So this is Motoyama's review of Porter, the author of the article we just read. This one, clusters in the new economics competition. So he reviews Porter's theory, which became popular at both the academic and policy levels, as well as received a series of critiques. So this article provides a synthetic review, a view of those critiques. In addition, it reveals two new fundamental limitations of the theory. First, the descriptive and static nature of the theory limits the ability to replicate a successful cluster in practice. So, in other words, the current theory is more focused on describing how a cluster is organized today rather than how a cluster emerged. So, incorporating historical process can strengthen the practical application of cluster theory. Second, the interconnectedness of a cluster is hard to measure empirically. However, the theory does not explain how exactly the public sector can strengthen this aspect. So a dialogue with networking theories can potentially improve this application. So now this article is like they're showing us how do we apply cluster theory in practice. So I'll just skip directly here. So Michael, populative cluster approach, very successful. Description here of cluster theory, which already went through. I'll just skip here to the other part. Let's see, the application part here. Okay. This diagram over here, just I skipped by it, the um, sources of locational competitive advantage based on Porter's diamond framework. This one is a bit tricky. I think it's explained in the descriptions above. You just have to go over it a few times. I've seen a few videos online, but it's still tricky to understand. So I'm just telling you right now, this won't be included in the exam because like it's it's hard to understand. If I can understand it, I don't think I will give it in my exam. But anyway, let's go to the limitations of cluster theory. Okay, so this section will present limitations of the cluster theory and assess questions the theory cannot answer. So these questions are highly relevant to the application of the theory and the implementation of policy and are therefore important for both academics and practitioners. Essentially, the past literature identified three sort of problems with cluster theory. So first is the notion of regional competitiveness and specialization. Second, the geographical and industrial ambiguity of cluster theory. And then finally, universalism. So hopefully this will explain what these three factors are. First, the limitation of cluster theory is its notion of regional competitiveness and specialization. So basically, the idea that some regions have specific strengths and weaknesses. So it is not yet clear how regions compete or gain competitiveness. So Porter's description of cluster theory and his concept of competitiveness originally started with nations and essentially defined as the ability to maintain exports. So that's what Porter defines what we call this competitiveness is, like the ability to maintain exports. Um, by 1992, Porter advanced this concept with firms. His main focus on the term became a function of dynamic progressiveness, innovation, and an ability to change and improve. At the level of business practice, he further argues that firms may achieve competitiveness by differentiating with products or services or by producing at a lower cost. So this is kind of, you can see that happening today. So we must approach this argument of competitiveness carefully, which what is Motoyama saying. First, there are strong disagreements over Porter's strategies to achieve competitiveness in the fields of business economics, industrial organization, and management studies. He cites three studies here from 1992, 1996, and 2000. Second, it may be easier to apply this concept to firms, which are, let me just zoom a bit, which are micro units and can deliberately choose their products and business plan. Finding a niche product is plausible at the micro level. In contrast, regions are aggregated units and do not have their own will. Therefore, they do not choose or pursue a differentiation strategy. They do not choose or pursue a differentiation strategy when compared to firms. Or is it possible for a region, a collective unit, including firms, governments, and universities, to form differentiation strategy? A niche, what do you call this? Is there such a thing as regionally differentiated products? Or is there a niche market for 20 companies? This is unclear. So note that the vague setting of goals, such as promotion of regional competitiveness or even a specific industry, is not what Motoyama calls a differentiation strategy. So I think we need to define that a bit before we go further. I'll just save this. So what is a differentiation strategy? I think this is another economic term, Okay. So a differentiation strategy is a strategy that involves the development of unique products that differ significantly from competitors. By doing so, a company can convince customers to accept higher price points, which in turn results in higher margins. So Motoyama is saying that at larger scales, like at the regional and even the provincial level, it would be difficult to create a strategy for a product that's specifically for that province or region because it's too large and it's too vague. Porter's competitiveness is different from traditional sense of place competitiveness in economic development, such as defined by Storper in 1997. So the ability of an economy to attract and maintain firms with stable or rising market shares in an activity while maintaining or increasing standards of living for those who participate in it. So this is the Storper definition of competitiveness. Here, Storper uses it in a passive context and sees it as a description of a region. Thus, he does not attempt to explain the causal mechanism of growth of the region. On the other hand, Porter, in his 2000 writing, argues that this is an active strategy and something people, firms, or regions can achieve. The something is the cluster. So, in this somewhat confusing analogy between firms and regions, Porter interchangeably uses competitiveness and productivity and makes statements such as productivity then defines competitiveness. So Motoyama says this is a bit nonsensical. According to Porter, a successful firm has the intention and capability to achieve higher productivity and profitability. If Porter argues that firms with higher productivity have competitiveness, it does not explain any cause. So, with this ambiguity, several scholars question what precisely is the differentiation or competitiveness of regions. So this analytical weakness leads to the limitation of regional specialization. So let's suppose regional differentiation is possible, as Porter claims. Although Porter in 1998 strongly discourages competition by doing the same thing, there are quite a few disagreements about whether this specialization is good for the region over the long term or good at all. So back in the 1960s, another author, Chinitz and J. Jacobs, discussed the diversity of economy as a sort of growth. That discussed the diversity of economy. So talking about different specializations. There's little evidence to suggest that regions based on a specialization consistently have a higher rate of innovation and economic growth. So the following authors from like 2000, 2003, 2001, 1998, and 1999, also 2004 and 2000, another again at 2004. So there's Martin and Sunday. Anyway, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 studies have pointed out that boom and bust cycles of many high-tech sectors, which are often based on specialization, bring risks. Instead, a regional portfolio strategy may be preferred. So that is, in the short term, a region may promote a specialized industrial cluster, as Porter would suggest. However, in the long term, a region must develop a handful of clusters to avoid an over-reliance on a specific sector. At the same time, we have to be cautious because we do not know yet which industry clusters may have synergistic effects and how the development of a cluster in the beginning stage may benefit the development of another cluster in the next stage. So these are the issues that cluster theory has not addressed, and future research is needed. Basically saying that, as I mentioned earlier, I was talking about school clusters, medical clusters. If you go to the macro scale, like the regional and provincial scale, it's dangerous and risky to just have one cluster for that whole region. So again, sort of echoing what we talked about earlier, at the micro scale, barangays and even cities should be mixed use. And also this applies to the regional and provincial scale. So there also must be a mix of clusters because we can't just have one cluster. And then if that cluster fails, the whole region or province might also fail. Just like competitiveness, this concept of specialization may be underdeveloped at this moment. This is written in 2008 and interchangeably used at different levels. So specialization can take place with a firm with different products or services, an industry with different segments of industry, computer chip design, etc., and a region with selected industries. So with the current cluster theory, all these levels are mixed and policymakers choose whichever level is convenient for their purpose. So there's a degree of ambiguity or sort of just haziness na you can apply a cluster theory seemingly at every level and it will just work, but in actuality, it it needs more definition. So that was the first limitation. Again, the first limitation is that cluster theory does not sort of differentiate between regional competitiveness and specialization. So basically, cluster theory is just vague, no specific theory. It doesn't really think about the different levels of the what they call this government or like groups. So at the municipal level, it's very applicable. Like and now even smaller than that, at the micro level, like firms and businesses, it's applicable. But city level, maybe not so much. Just one cluster for one city may not be applicable, and also provincial and regional may not also be applicable as well. So Motoyama is suggesting that instead of having only one specialization for one region, you need multiple specializations. Next, so the second limitation is at the empirical level, that is concerning geographical boundaries and industrial ambiguities. So remember, the cluster is defined as, I'll just go back, geographic concentrations of interconnected companies in a particular field. So what is that? How do you define that geographic boundary? So it is practical to challenge, or it is a practical challenge to identify the geographical boundary of a cluster. So Porter, in his 1998 writing, has provided only a weak analytical definition. So a cluster's boundaries are defined by linkages and complementaries across industries and institutions that are most important to competition. So as a result, the definition of a cluster is not standardized. So it's based on industries, linkages that may or may not occur in different geographical areas. So we have two studies here by Martin and Sunli, and people, as a result, the definition of a cluster is not standardized, and people use clusters, cities, and regions interchangeably. So this is highlighted by these researchers here from 2003, 2006, 1998, and 2001. Just as we discussed when looking at regional differentiation. So there is no definition being where does, what do you call this? Where are the boundaries for clusters? So indeed, Porter in his 1998 writing himself uses a variety of scales in his US cluster map. And it ranges from cities such as New York City or Boston, metropolitan areas such as Silicon Valley or the Los Angeles area, and sub-state units, Southern Florida or Western Michigan, and states of Colorado. So you can see here in the previous reading, you can check. So we have Seattle, Oregon, Boise, that's a place, I guess, Las Vegas, Phoenix. So we have here one cluster for one state in Seattle, and then meanwhile here in the Los Angeles area, so we have Silicon Valley, Carlsbad. So there are three clusters in one state. So these boundaries are, I think you're familiar now, are different states. So several clusters may occur in one state, or maybe it's just one cluster per one state. So that's a bit questionable. Then going further, so this leads to erroneous ambiguities at the policy-making level. For instance, being in Silicon Valley, should the cities of San Jose and San Francisco create a strategic plan together or separately? So these are cities within Silicon Valley. Are they within the same cluster? Should they pursue the same specialization or differentiation? More important, how can they do these things? At the current moment, it is hard for a cluster theory to generate answers for these practical applications. Although the inconsistency in the geographical boundaries is a reasonable critique, that may not be a problem created by Porter alone. So true, Porter did not and could not provide a clear geographical scale of clusters. However, this weakness should not doom the whole meaning of the theory because such variation in scale is simply the nature of economy. So Motoyama is saying that that's just natural, that there's no clear boundary. Economic geographers have known that the scale of an economic region varies by place and by industry, given its historical development and topographical limitations. So people know that Manhattan, for example, has strong media, advertisement, and financial clusters, whereas Silicon Valley is stretched is a stretched yet connected area for semiconductor and internet industries. On the other hand, recent studies with geographic information systems, or GIS, uh, analysis indicate that clustering occurs at substantially smaller uh, intra, so within regional scale, such as within 5 miles. Let me just convert that real quick. 5 miles to kilometers. We're thinking 8 kilometers, 8 kilometer radius. According to three studies by Curd and Connolly in 2008, Funberg and Bornet in 2008 as well, and then Rosenthal and Strange in 2003. So why are there such differences in scale? There is no currently grand theory to explain this issue in the entire field of economic geography. But after all, we do not have, nor do we need to have a single definition of what a scale of a region is. So the answer varies by context and purposes. So expecting the cluster theory to solve this puzzle may be over criticizing it or expecting too much. In the meantime, we have to be careful when analyzing clusters, especially at the policy level, because this affects at which scale to intervene and what to promote. So that was the second. Oh, wait, I'm still on the second. So there is another dimension to this empirical ambiguity, talking about the boundaries of clusters at the industrial level. So Porter argues that clusters cut across industries defined by standard industrial classification, or SIC. But what he explained as strong and weak linkages is unclear. Often the rules used to distinguish clusters are highly arbitrary and highly impressionistic. Moreover, clusters identified as showing superior performance are anecdotal and based on success stories about particular locations. Basically, cherry picking success stories, and maybe we're missing the whole picture, especially like at a provincial or state or regional scale. So there are a few studies that examine whether clustering within particular industries is beneficial. So there's only one cited here from 1997. The conventional method to identify a cluster is to use a location quotient, taking into account industry, employment, and growth rate, and also export activities. So this was based on a study in 2000. It is easy to identify some elements of a cluster. So firms, labor, some suppliers, such as legal and consulting services, and core customers. It is then, therefore, possible, though not easy, to quantify the related and supporting industries, such as governments, universities, standard setting agencies, think tanks, etc. However, these elements must be carefully selected because not all branches of those organizations deal with a particular cluster and its industrial activities. We have to keep in mind that this selection process becomes somewhat arbitrary. So more trouble comes when analyzing the core of the theory, the interconnectedness within a cluster. So input-output tables are one of the few tools, but determining the threshold for a decent or high-level interconnectedness among identified sub-industrial sectors is a subjective process. Virtually all industrial sectors have some form of transaction with one another. Having a transaction is merely a satisfactory condition to identify a strong linkage. Furthermore, input-output tables capture only monetary transactions, not the critical part of interconnectedness, which are firm rivalry and collaboration. Marshallian externalities and knowledge spillovers and are also included in that interconnectedness. So I'll just say this one is a new term for me, Marshallian externalities. Marshallian externalities. So Marshallian externalities is a strong evidence for existence of external economies of scale that are limited in their industrial and geographical scope, such as external economies. Basically, Marshallian externalities are just external economies that may provide some impact to those industries or jobs. Okay. So scholars in this field frequently argue that such externalities and spillovers are key to promoting the growth of a region, which means that cluster theory as it stands today does not measure this integral part of regional development. Given these difficulties in, oh, sorry, given these difficulties in empirical identification, most efforts to quantify clusters end up as a regrouping exercise with industrial codes. So there have been several serious methodological attempts to identify clusters. Held in 1996, Austrian in 2000, combine both quantitative and qualitative data. So there are manuals to identify clusters for practitioners made in 1996 and 1995. Moreover, Hill and Brennan from the 2000s and Funderburg and Bronet in 2008 used their statistical cluster method or the principal component analysis, which can identify common elements to identify industrial clusters. Each attempt tends to improve the sophistication in identifying clusters. However, it does not completely solve the problem because of the two issues stated earlier: the theoretical vagueness between strong and weak linkages, and the difficulty in measuring interconnectedness. So those are two key factors that are hard to put into numbers. And then if it's not being if you can't measure it or put it into numbers, it will be very difficult to replicate it. So that's the key thing here. If cluster theory is so good and like essential for economic development, there must be a way to measure and then replicate it somewhere else. Otherwise, it's not really useful for us. So how do we create economic development policies without a way to replicate what kind of phenomena are happening in clusters? Thus, though these are more theoretical hurdles to clear than methodological ones. In the meantime, we have to keep in mind one reality: scholars, policymakers, and business leaders often use cluster theory with whatever geographical boundary and industrial category is convenient, without questioning it, and sometimes even without identifying it. So this is a problem, especially for identifying sort of districts. So I mentioned earlier, I'll show it again, the different sort of groups or areas, or let's say, I guess, districts in Cebu that have been identified by, I think, at the very least, a proposal from 2022. This is not official yet. This does not have an ordinance. This is just still a proposal from the Cebu City Planning Office. So if you look at their groups, they're just called upland, peri-urban, uptown, midtown, and then downtown. So nothing about industry yet. These labels more describe the geographical location of these groups, and I think it's really the topography and location that define these groupings. So not really cluster related. But if they do want to make an economic development plan, eventually we have to identify some kind of cluster. So first problem of cluster is that it's not really clear whether it's applicable just at the micro scale, or is it also applicable at the city and provincial scale, and furthermore the regional scale. And then the second problem is the physical boundaries of clusters are also not clearly defined. Then finally, the third problem is universalism. So what is universalism? I'll just do a quick search here. Universalism. So universalism implies that it is possible to apply generalized norms, values, or concepts to all people and cultures, regardless of the context in which they are located. So again, this idea of copy-pasting theories and expecting them to work in one location, and then expecting them to work exactly the same in another location could be challenging to prove in practice. So it is natural to expect that the types of cluster elements, intra-regional connections, and development differ depending on this industry. So, for example, the role played by a university will be substantially more important for biochemical and pharmaceutical industries than for the apparel industry. This variation among industries affect how a new business is formed, what kind of support is needed, and who the customers will be. Yet, the current cluster theory does not fully consider this variation, which consequently means that the development pattern is taken to be universal and the same strategy is applied to different industries. The theory should pay attention to industry specific conditions and incorporate them into policy. So, in the course of promoting clusters, many regional governments, I think most of these are in the US, end up with targeting so called hot industries such as biotech, information technology, creative media, and nanotech in the last decade. This was written in 2008. This happens partly because politicians seek high-tech sectors that will mobilize resources, and because local governments follow funding from higher-level national government. So whereas Porter emphasized regional differentiation and specialization, ironically, a certain sameness is developing with clusters of similar industries. So the story teaches us a few lessons. The decision of which cluster to promote must be decentralized at the local government because local government should know the strengths of the local economy and specialization best. So at the same time, selection must require caution. So naively identifying what sounds like the best for the local economy and adopting the cluster initiative is hardly I don't know what this word is. What is panacea? Panacea, basically a solution or remedy for all difficulties or diseases. It's not the term I'm familiar with is a cure-all or a silver bullet. So in addition to the speciality and potential of local economy, local policymakers have to analyze what other regions are pursuing and what seems more feasible in comparison. So this idea of looking at the regional scale to identify what should be the clusters that a city or municipality needs, and this idea of inter-regional collaboration or planning. So this really falls in line with urban planning because urban planners tend to work at the regional or maybe even provincial scale. Okay, let's see. Further assessment of the cluster theory, two new critiques. So this is, I think, important for us as well. So past literature has suggested three limitations of cluster theory, whereas there are major shortcomings. This article raises an additional two more critical limitations of cluster theory. So at the beginning, it seems like such a good thing to have clusters. And this is very much what happens in the masteral and even the doctoral world. We have like a good idea that seems like it will work, but then if you dig through it deeper, you'll see there's a lot of things, there are a lot of gaps. And then it is within these gaps that we hope that our masteral students and maybe even undergrad students can find or fill in or figure out how can we make these like good ideas actually function in practice. But sometimes maybe it's really not meant to be. But anyway, for cluster theory, here are two new critiques: the descriptive and static nature of the theory, and also the practical application of enhancing the interconnectedness of a identified cluster. So on the bottom line, the cluster theory is a general description of how regional industrial complex is usually organized. Porter himself acknowledges this general nature. So clusters are a striking feature of virtually every national, regional, state, and metropolitan economy. So implications from this inductively produced conclusion should not be considered lightly. That is, most industrial complexes on a regional scale have the elements described by cluster theory anyway. So the formation of a cluster per se does not necessarily produce growth, innovation, or competitiveness. So what Motoyama is saying is that a cluster does not really signify growth. Maybe the growth's already happening, and then the cluster is just a side effect. The existence of industrial cluster X in region A hardly means anything. So it is first important to realize that cluster X also exists in cluster B, C, and so on. and perhaps all the way to Z if you look at the global scale. So it is more important for policymakers to ask how and why cluster X in region D grew in comparison with regions that might with other regions, and how that might apply to region A. Basically, this sentence is saying, for example, we have I would consider a very healthy medical cluster in the Fuente Osmeña area in Cebu. Um, if you want to replicate a cluster, I think what Motoyama is saying that we should analyze how the cluster formed and how it grew before we start thinking of its application to other areas. Like, for example, if you want to create another medical cluster somewhere else in Cebu City. So Motoyama provides an example here, a comparative case of Boston and Silicon Valley, two of the most famous computer electronics clusters in the US. Needless to say, both regions satisfy all of the elements described in cluster theory. So they have firms, suppliers, customers, and even strong research universities. At the second level, these elements have some level of interaction. So they have rivalry between firms, procurements from suppliers, and industry university relationships. But why did Silicon Valley outgrow Boston? Apparently, Silicon Valley developed more than Boston. So the cluster theory cannot answer this. A highly generic statement about competition and collaboration captures little of the dynamics of the regions. On the other hand, another study by Saxenian in 1994 would argue that the key was specifics in how the interconnection was developed and organized at each region. So Silicon Valley's flexible labor market, horizontal interfirm relationships, and less hierarchical inter-organization structure promoted more information flow and hence the creation of innovation. So these are factors identified by a 1994 study. So the current analytical framework of cluster theory does not provide this insight into why a region grows more than others. So at this moment, the focus of cluster theory is whether a cluster grows. One critical question that policymakers should always keep in mind is whether the policies of one particular industrial cluster will be more effective in comparison with others. So the descriptive nature of the theory is highly correlated with its static nature, and the framework provided by the cluster theory shows how a successful industrial complex and regional economy is organized today, but not how a successful regional economy emerges. So they're just explaining, Motoyama's arguing that Porter's cluster theory is just explaining what's currently happening, but does not explain how that cluster emerges or how that cluster is created. And that's the key thing we want to do, because in a developing country, we want to create more productivity, and maybe we want to create similar clusters as the US, but we don't know how. So for policymakers, the focus should be on achieving the development of a cluster, which is by definition a process issue. Most likely, finding a solution will require historical analysis, and a cluster at each stage must come with specific development conditions. So the different stages of the company. So ignoring history is counterproductive because each region, according to the cluster theory, is supposed to develop an industrial cluster that specializes according to its unique indigenous capability. So imitating today's most successful industrial complex, such as Silicon Valley, is hardly a solution. Instead, that would be almost the same as replacing a child's arms and legs with adult ones and assuming that he or she can be a top level fashion model immediately. So there's this very serious warning against copying clusters or models from different locations and applying it here. You could probably use that as a criticism of Osmeña's Singapore-like slogan. But anyway, it's just a slogan, so it's not really that big a deal. So as Porter emphasizes, development of industrial cluster goes through a dynamic process. However, Porter's analysis is not dynamic, or more precisely, not longitudinal, because he presents only the developed and successful clusters and provides no historical analysis of cluster development. His California wine cluster in Figure 2 is a prime example. So that's, I think it's down here. So this one, the wine cluster we examined last week. So this diagram clearly and succinctly presents what cluster elements there are and how they are connected in California today. It would be more insightful if he could present the wine cluster in the 1970s or before. Suppose the tourism cluster, public relations and advertising, and the Culinary Institute were not incorporated into the wine cluster at the time. Then we would be able to draw a few more conclusions. Adding or connecting those elements is a critical process. More important, historical analysis may reveal how to avoid them, how to what do you call this? Sorry, not avoid. More important, historical analysis may reveal how to add them, meaning clusters, how they emerge, which key player made the connection, and so on. Policymakers could then replicate the process stage by stage in more detail. So far, Porter in 1994 has referred to, to this historical process only once. The historical attributes are interacting and are enhanced in mutually reinforcing cumulative process in which causality becomes difficult to disentangle. Basically, just a fancy way of saying that different elements are working together and then you can't really determine the cause. So, moreover, in a footnote, he acknowledged that there is a role for chance in historical accident. Contrary to much recent research, however, many events that look accidental are indigenous or determined by the local environment. However, Porter provides no further explanation, but instead leaves it paradoxical if historical attributes and chances uh, indigenous, and the opposite of indigenous, indigenous, meaning endogenous, meaning having an internal cause or origin. So, however, Porter provides no explanation, but instead leaves it paradoxical if historical attributes and changes endogenously determine the cluster development, as he claims. Replication of cluster would be impossible if you can't explain what creates a cluster. So we have to analyze what part of development was accidental and what could be applicable to other regions. Although Porter himself has not done so, a few other scholars have conducted analysis on the development of clusters. So we have Feldman and Francis in 2004, Hillenkrautz and Ludenkeist in 2003, and then Ludenkeist and Power in 2002. So each pursued rich, in-depth historical studies and analyzed the data at the case level. At this moment, generalization is not yet possible, just as Porter explained, and there are many things unanswered with regard to the issue. Both scholars and practitioners should pay more attention to the historical development processes. And then finally, the last limitation of cluster theory is its feasibility and whether and how the government can effectively fill in the missing components of a cluster. So, for example, this is just like just a few more. So, a government wants to replicate a cluster. If a specific element in a cluster is missing, such as suppliers, a logical policy consequence would be for the government to provide grants to attract or nurture them, like suppliers, I mean. So, however, in reality, there is hardly a case unless the government plans to form a cluster from scratch. The private sector is not blind and has usually looked for business opportunities. Even if there's a gap, how well government can promote the missing components is questionable. The more difficult part is to promote the interconnectedness of a cluster. If a firm in a cluster does not have sufficient spillover or synergistic effects, what can government do? The cluster theory may point out that government should do something about it, but it's not explained how. So to this end, cluster theory should establish a dialogue with network-related studies in the economic development literature that discusses the connections between firms and the promotion of information sharing. So these studies from 1993, 1999, 1998, 95 to 1990, these studies incidentally also show that the interconnectedness of a cluster, of the cluster theory was not theoretically new. In any case, what happened because of the limited budget constraint and the policy level was a dichotomous Dichotomous. I don't know what that is. Let me just check. Dictomus. Sorry. Victim. Ah, sorry. Dichotomous, meaning two. So dichotomy means, let's see, a division or contrast between two things that are separated or being opposed or entirely different. So the sentence was, in any case, what happened because of the limited budget constraint at the policy level was dichotomous, a dichotomous divide between the cluster and the network approaches. Previously, network promoting policies were often replaced by new political initiatives aimed at cluster formation. Instead, there should be a bridge between two approaches with a special focus on how to promote linkages between cluster elements. So conclusion here, it's already 4:31. This article reviewed the weaknesses of cluster and cluster theory in its theoretical, empirical, and policy aspects. The new critiques raised in this article present critical limitations of cluster theory for analytical framework and from the policy perspective. So the most important thing is that we found that cluster theory's descriptive and static nature necessitates a dynamic analysis. This requires analysis of not only how a successful cluster is organized today, but also how it emerged, what kind of challenges it faced and resolved, and who played a major catalyst role. Such analysis must be longitudinal, case-specific, and in-depth. So I don't know what this longitudinal analysis is. Let's double check. Longitudinal analysis. So longitudinal study is a research design that involves repeated observations of the same variables over short or long periods of time. It is often a type of observational study, although it can be structured as a longitudinal randomized experiment. Basically, longitudinal in this context means that it has to be studied over and over again at different locations or like at different applications. Although it's one of the core arguments, the cluster theory has been shown to be weak in explaining how to develop in the interconnectedness and network aspect within a region. Whereas we have known that externalities and knowledge spillovers are critical for innovation and regional growth, we still know little about how exactly that happens. At this stage, however, cluster theory lacks any analysis of internal organization of a business enterprise. Perhaps one possibility to incorporate the work on tacit knowledge by Nonaka and Takuchi from their 1995 publication, and more applied work in economic geography by Gertler in 2003, in which they argue that formation and sharing of knowledge, critical for creating innovation, often takes place within a firm because it is embedded in organizational routines. So scholars who support the cluster theory, as well as those who study economic development in general, need to analyze how such insight can be applied at the interfirm and regional scale. Although it provided several critiques, this article did not intend to denounce the whole cluster theory. The theory is extremely popular and potentially powerful. However, as with many other theories in economic development, the analysis of the weakness of the theory will help in theoretical and empirical development. So, because the role of scholars in economic development is to identify the holes in many theories and seek potential bridges within policies. So I hope this analysis will be helpful in that development. So clusters are a good thing, they exist, but we don't know how to make them, we don't know how to measure them, and then we don't know, what was the third one? I can't remember. I just read it. The third one was how it can be incorporated into a policy. Industry-specific conditions and incorporate them into policy. Okay, so I'll just go to the top part here. First, so the three issues are, I'll just highlight it again. First is the notion of regional competitiveness and specialization is vague. Basically, we can't Porter applies cluster theory at regional, local levels, like interchangeably, so it's not very clear. There is no clear definition of a geographical boundary for clusters. And then there is a sort of vagueness that clusters can be copy pasted anywhere. So basically, we don't know how clusters are formed. And then the two additional concerns of Motoyama is that um, current cluster theory is more focused on describing how a cluster is organized rather than how a cluster is emerged. And then the second one is the theory does not explain exactly the public sector, how the public sector can strengthen these aspects, strengthen interconnectedness. Because if we go back, cluster theory is defined by geographic location, where innovation and interconnectedness is very strong. So how do but the theory does not explain how to strengthen interconnectivity and what was it? Innovation within clusters. It just seems to the way Porter writes it, it just happens. So those are the things na we should try to figure out. I think this is why we have the following policies or case studies. I mean, Oregon and Minneapolis. So it's already 4:30. I'll just go on without the break. So this is mobilizing Oregon clusters, uh, cluster mapping from the U.S. Economic Development Group. Let's see. So this is written by the Oregon Business Council. Prepared for the Oregon Business Council by Elizabeth Redman and IHS Global Insight. So I'll just skip to the summary. So globalization's repercussions have been important drivers in mobilizing leaders to use innovative approaches to improve regional competitiveness. So in many regions across the US, cluster development efforts have proven to be an effective way to encourage collaboration among companies in the same or related industries and among public, private, and academic sectors. Notice that they don't highlight any sources. They just say that it does. Let's put this as notes. Okay. Over the last few decades, cluster practitioners have gained significant experience in how to turn industry collaboration into better government policies and competitive advantages for firms. However, much of this experience resides with individuals and organizations that have taken cluster-based approach to economic development. This proposal, mobilizing Oregon clusters, the first in a series of 4 policy and impact studies developed as part of the U.S. Cluster Mapping Project and presented by the U.S. Economic Development Administration, is designed to share experiences and lessons from from the Oregon Business Council, the OBC, a non-profit business membership organization composed of the state's largest and most established companies. So they have a short history here of Oregon. So Oregon is let's just bring that up on the map. There's So Oregon is in the northwest of the US over here. So that's the geographic location of Oregon. And let's just read the report for their history. So for much of its history, from its days as a trapping and trading outpost in the 1700s to the gold rush of the 1800s, the surging domestic demand for food products, lumber, and ships during World War I, Oregon has relied heavily on its abundance of natural resources. Period. The post-World War II era marked a transition for Oregon's modern economy, centered on Portland, centered in Portland, the economic engine of the state. In the mid-1940s ushered in the conversion of the timber industry to a diversified forest products cluster, as well as the rise of the technology industry. Some of the country's early pioneer companies, such as Tektronix, Electro-Scientific Industries, led the way to what would become Oregon's high-tech cluster. While Oregon's economy still depends on agriculture and natural resources, it also has established positions in electronics, software, food processing, clean energy, biotechnology, tourism, etc. So underpinning this economic growth and diversification is a business environment with a number of attractive assets and well-educated workforce. In 2009, Oregon ranked 17th nationally in the U.S. for a percentage of residents with at least a bachelor's degree, and then more than 10% of the state's population had an advanced degree or higher. So Oregon, the state, offers a high quality of life with access to outdoors and vibrant arts and culture scene, many parks, greenways, etc., relative to those technology hubs in its neighbors north and south. In addition, relatively low electricity costs. Businesses are connected to the world via Port of Portland, airports, railways, ships that pass through the Columbia River and the Pacific Ocean from national and international destinations. So at the same time, Oregon's business environment has several weaknesses. The state's tax structure, which relies on personal and corporate income taxes, exacerbates budget deficits in recessionary times. So as a result, during downturns, Oregon's business not only suffer from weak national and global demand, but also from a decline in the quality and availability of state public services. In addition to tax structure, other regulatory issues such as limited availability of shovel-ready industrial land and federal control of most of its state's timber tend to slow development. So the state also has failed to keep pace with investments in higher education, while early okay. Finally, for established firms, the local market, relative small major markets, are long distances away. So now, basically, local market is it's relatively small, and major markets such as California and Eastern U.S. population and Asia are long distances away. So there's a weakness there in collaborating locally and internationally as well. So the tax structure is weak to, I want to highlight this part here, recessionary times, because I don't think we discussed the economic cycle. The economic cycle is, I think, widely agreed to exist everywhere. So around the world, regionally and also locally and nationally, there are four phases of an economic cycle. So there's the expansion phase where there's growth, where outperformers are information technology, finances, etc. But this is not so important for us. We just need to know the four phases. So there's an expansion, there's a peak where basically the highest point of economic development, and then a contraction or a recession. And then eventually there's a throw or basically the lowest point, and then we start to recover again. And this happens everywhere, although not at the same time. Some countries have higher expansion phases, some countries have higher peak phases, and some countries have higher contraction or recession phases, etc., etc. So it really goes up and down. And then we can see that in, for example, Philippine GDP. Let me see. I think I have an image here. Maybe, yeah, I'll just use this one here. So with this graph here from the PSA, so gross domestic product, this is for Philippine GDP. So this is national level. So it was at 5.7, then 5.4, then 6.3, then 6.7. So we can call this 3 quarters here from 2018 to 2019 as sort of the, expansion phase. And then eventually we reach a peak phase, maybe here in the 2018 to 2019, and then we get hit with a pandemic, which triggers a contraction phase. So contraction all the way up to 2020, which we hit the throw or the lowest point, and then we start recovery again. Eventually we'll reach a peak, and then we'll go down to contraction, and then we go up to recovery again. So that's the only variable here, is that some countries have higher peaks and other countries have higher lows. So that's just something I want to clarify. Okay, so basically, Oregon wants to establish clusters kind of to address its weaknesses. And over here, based on this mix of strengths and weaknesses, the state's industrial composition and the state's industrial composition, Oregon has more or less tracked the economic performance of the U.S. Recessions in the 1980s and 2000s hit Oregon hard due to associated steep downturn in housing and technology and Oregon's heavy exposure to these industries. Conversely, the state has grown strongly in the national upswings for similar reasons. The productivity of Oregon's economy has steadily improved since 2000, and the state in 2001 had a higher average real per capita GDP than the US. However, average compensation levels remain relatively unchanged from the tech bubble implosion from 2001 to 2002, and the unemployment in Oregon also remains above the national level due to the 2008 recession. This was the global financial crisis. So let me just double check. When was this report written? Winter of 2013. So that's like fourth quarter of 2013. So what are their kanang solutions? I'll just go over this quickly. It's already 5 o'clock. The economic performance, pulling ahead, strengths become clear, sophisticated. Clearly, over time, we'll just engage in. So what is their created to coordinate strengthen statewide trade cluster efforts mission? Grow economy, create high-paying jobs through cluster network. I'll just skip to the part here. By participating in the cluster network, public and private leaders may make new connections, share best practices, and learn new tools for enhancing industry growth. In some cases, participating clusters have become more sophisticated and strategic in their approach because individual company leaders have joined together with their competitors to develop cluster-level strategies. Okay. So here are some examples of successes in Oregon. So Northwest Food Processing Association transformed from being a traditional industry association to using forward-thinking, innovative cluster approach, new business partnerships. So I'm just going to skip to the part of what did they learn. So, well, while the Oregon Business Plan and Cluster Network maintain the same basic structure and goals in 2012 as they did at their inception, much has been learned over the years from, 2012 to 2013. In retrospect, the following elements have been essential to the Oregon Business Plan. Oregon Business Cluster's ability to effectively play the role of cluster analyst and convener. So one lesson or factor was private sector leadership. As membership organization with a private sector board of directors, the OBC has always counted on high-level involvement from Oregon's private sector leaders. Without close ties to Oregon's business leaders, it would have been difficult to effectively respond to Oregon's industry challenges. So key here is private sector leadership. The openness of cluster organizations. It is important that all self-identified clusters participate in discovering shared value and improving competitiveness. The nature of cluster organizations varies. Sometimes they are government-led, and other times they are trade associations. Building cluster efforts around realities of such existing structures enable faster impact and mobilization of available resources. And then third here, how many are there? There's 6 lessons. All clusters are good. Rather than focus on targeted industry sectors, the OBC, the Oregon Business Cluster, has chosen to support cluster development for all traded sector industries and encourage clusters at all stages of development to become more self-aware, better organized, and more strategic about defining their shared interests and opportunities for growth. So a shared resource, and then fourth, a shared resource for cluster efforts. What are their shared resources? Best practices. Basically, they share information. Although the OBC is not a cluster organization itself, it enables such cluster organizations to emerge and helps them to tap into common knowledge and capability base. This structure enhances efficiency, creates more openness, and naturally positions the OBC to anchor the cluster activities and a broader economic development strategy for the state. And the last two is diversified funding sources and operational efficiency and staff characteristics and responsibility. So I think that's a bit self-explanatory, but where are they getting their funding? The OBC and economic development work has been supported by a number of revenue sources, including private companies, foundations, business associations, federal, state, and local governments, with an annual operating budget of $100,000. The cluster network has remained lean as it relied on primarily a team of consultants, one consultant, OBC administrative support staff, and the Oregon business plan project manager, and many volunteers. So it's very volunteer based with one main consultant. So a significant contributor to the success of the OBC has been its reliance on staff and volunteers who see the value in networking, convening, and connecting. So by employing people or networkers who are naturally good communicators and connectors, the OBC is able to serve as a conduit for Oregon's many organizations focused on industry competitiveness, economic development, and general business climate issues. So, in conclusion, policymakers can learn from Oregon's adoption of clusters as an organizing principle. Its focus on collaboration between public-private sectors and integration of cluster priorities into a broader statewide economic development strategy. They can learn from the OBC's experience in helping cluster efforts to emerge, operate, and in the choices it has made to support organizational structures. However, each location needs to devise the right competitiveness strategy to leverage its unique mix of industry clusters, business environment conditions, and in turn increasing business growth, productivity, and business information. So one thing I want to highlight here is how did they do that? Let's see. Organizational movement. So let's see. Public sector partner for economic growth. Or sorry, the Oregon Business Council. Sorry, it's not Oregon Business Cluster. It's Oregon Business Council. I just want to see what they did. Activities of the Business Councils on page 17. What kinds of activities were they participating in? Let's see. In 2002, against recessionary background, the Oregon USA representative collaborated to initiate a summit of statewide business and elected leaders to plan a strategy for economic recovery. The Oregon Business Council formed a steering committee of business associations to oversee the project. Planning and policy recommendations for the summit held in December of that year resulted in the creation of the Oregon Business Plan as an annual forum for shaping state economic development policies and promoting specific initiatives to support those policies. Using the framework in Figure 4, the Oregon Business Plan helps to set the stage for the state's leaders to pursue initiatives that create the right environment for Oregon's trade sector clusters to succeed. So let's just look at that business plan. And then the business plan, leadership committee, the state governors, and the speaker of Oregon House of Representatives. These are updated regularly through interviews. Okay, so the goal of the Oregon Business Framework Plan Framework is to create quality jobs in every corner of Oregon. A target of 25,000 net new jobs per year. Per capita income, to have the per capita income above the national average by 2020. So I'll leave it to you guys to check if Oregon is still competitive now. It's already 2023, so let's see if their goal was reached. But let's just look at how they created their plan. So clusters of innovative, sustainable, globally sustainable, and globally competitive industries. The trade-led sector businesses drive the Oregon economy. They export products and services outside of Oregon, bringing in fresh dollars to recirculate through payrolls, employee spending in the local economy, purchases from vendors, and tax revenues that fund critical public services like education. Industries that sell globally are both big and small. These industries tend to cluster based on access to shared resources, talent, suppliers, and other factors. So they have a diagram here. The traded or export sector is the foundation, and they export to suppliers and locals, sales to the rest, basically around the world. Most jobs are here in Oregon. So schools, hospitals, grocery stores, and restaurants. But firms in the traded sector are the ones who drive economy. So I'm curious to see what is under the traded slash export sector. So I guess these are the traded sectors. So advanced manufacturing, metals, machinery, transportation equipment, footwear, so apparel, outdoor gear, natural resources, high-tech resources, bioscience software, clean technology, and creative industries. Let's look at their strategy. Conditions for success, 4Ps for prosperity. So people creating a talented workforce, productivity, which requires quality infrastructure, resource utilization, competitive regulations, and business costs. Place, a high quality of life that attracts and retains talented people, and then pioneering innovation, a culture of research, commercialization, and innovation in product and process design. So these are, I guess, just a broad strokes what they did, but let's see. Industry cluster network. Okay, this one looks a bit more specific. So it's in its Oregon's journey to strengthen industry clusters. The OBC quickly noted that not all of Oregon's companies were aware of being in a cluster or being represented by an industry organization. Rather, several of Oregon's strong industry clusters weren't organized and lacked the infrastructure and leadership to come up with a common set of industry priorities or a collaborative approach to economic growth. Meanwhile, several industry groups use a cluster approach, identifying shared interests and synergistic opportunities, strengthening relationships, and etc. But were not obvious engines of the Oregon economy. So in the initial development of the Oregon business plan, the president of the OBC traveled around the state conducting regional meetings and industry focus groups. So this is one big thing. So the question here is, can Cebu City or your local community create an OBC or a business council, a local business council? Realizing that many policymakers and business leaders didn't understand the role of different parts of the different parts of the economy or the concept of industry clusters, Duncan Wise and others, I'm assuming they're part of the OBC, began emphasizing the importance of identifying Oregon's traded sector clusters and listening to their needs. So basically, they're an NGO. They went around. Their funds are coming from combination of donations, I guess sponsors, and maybe also a bit of like government sponsorship as well, or like funds from the local government. So I guess you need to have a group of people at the top who are professionals, are willing to lead these volunteers to these like meetings and focus groups. So we are basically an NGO. So growing statewide interest in cluster development ultimately led the OBC to hire a consultant to identify Oregon's mature, emerging, and potential industry clusters and assist cluster participants in their efforts to accelerate innovation and growth. So let's see. In 2005, OBC launched the Oregon Network Cluster Network, renamed the Oregon Industry Cluster Network in 2012. The cluster network with the goals of becoming a network catalyst and a broker of information, assisting related industries, forming effective cluster working groups, and then being an advocate for facilitator of issues. Yeah, so basically an NGO. In 2012, the cluster network with an annual budget of 40 to $100,000 was staffed in part by a consultant and the OBC staff. Yeah, okay. So the cluster network meets 4 to 6 times per year. Not really that much, 4 to 6 times per year, like every 2 months, uh, to discuss progress on cluster-based economic development, focus on cross-cutting areas of interest for multiple clusters, etc., etc. So some of the specific questions addressed in these meetings include: what are the needs of each cluster in terms of economic infrastructure, workforce, skills, technology, finance, and other infrastructure? How well can those needs be met within Oregon? Then what could be done to enhance relevant economic infrastructure and improve the relationship among public, private, academic, and social service stakeholders? So what specific actions would move the clusters in Oregon forward in the near, mid, and long term? Okay, so they have identified natural resources, they have a website, leadership summits, initial outcomes, indicators of success, competitive index, conclusion. Let's go to good. I'll just go to the conclusion very quickly. I'll discuss the second cluster. So, as a business membership organization led by many volunteers from Oregon's largest and most established businesses, the OBC has contributed significantly to statewide economic development. And then by connecting business leaders with one another and with key Oregon decision makers, including elected officials, academic leaders, and nonprofit directors. So it's just saying that the OBC was successful. Let's compare that with the other one. So the Minneapolis St. Paul Regional Cluster Initiative. Okay, so I'm expecting something similar. Mhm. Okay. See. It's content based on broad set publishing for the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minneapolis, the largest metropolitan region. Challenges. So the emergence of the cluster approach from common language to common action. Okay, an important foundation for use of cluster-based economic development approach in MSP, Minneapolis St. Paul region, set in 2006 when DEED funded a program for the Humphrey School to provide training on clusters for its staff. Let me just, what's DEED coming in? Okay. In spring of 2009, the RCM, what is the RCM? Workforce engagement, K-12. It assured equal funding. I think the ACM is just like a group. The state local policy program of Hubert H. Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the University of Minnesota, and the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. So that's the DEED, Department of Employment and Economic Development. DEED developed a regional strategy for workforce development, and then the RCM, which the RCM adopted, and then based on an industry cluster approach, leveraging funding from DEED. Around the same time as MSP, let's see what their approach was. Okay. So they formed an RCI. What is the RCI? And this is what I get for jumping around, but we really don't have time. Let's see. I'll just go look for the abbreviations somewhere. This was also written out in 2013. Acknowledgements, executive summary. Okay, I found the RC. So Regional Council of Mayors is RCM. Where is RCS? Regional Council of something. RCM. Here, Regional Cluster Initiative. Started in 2009 as a central platform to apply the cluster concept in a broader set of issues important to competitiveness in the region of um, MSP or Minneapolis St. Paul. So let's look at their objectives, outcomes, and measures. So we have here objectives, research cluster and headquarters importance, identified 10 competitive industry clusters, conducted in-depth studies of the three clusters in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and their expected outcomes was greater investment in entrepreneurship, stronger public-private relationships, and increased out-of-state venture capital relative to other states, increased job growth in clusters. Deepen regional linkages, formalize linkages with medical devices cluster leaders, and recommended public action plan. So these are their objectives, outcomes, and measures. I'm looking for their approach. I think that's the. Mhm. I guess I'll reread this. So I remember they're providing training on. So their approach is to provide training. The Humphrey School Executive Development Program helped shift the thinking of Minnesota's Workforce Development Agency from a supply side to a demand-driven approach to serving businesses and job seekers. The 110 participants included lead workforce development leadership, regional stakeholders in workforce development, regional stakeholders in workforce development, as well as representatives from Minnesota State College and universities, who together produced 22 cluster studies. The cluster training and studies contributed to a clear understanding of the strength of regional economies and the interdependence of Minneapolis rural and urban regions. So one of these studies focused on emerging renewable energy, the emerging renewable energy industry, and formed the basis of a 2007 Workforce Innovation and Regional Economic Development grant. So, they got a grant through the U.S. Department of Labor. The 5 million grant supported 36 Minnesota counties' efforts in jobs and skills training, entrepreneurship, innovation in the field of renewable energy. The success of these efforts led to the formation of the Minnesota Renewable Energy Marketplace, a statewide institution for collaboration, helping businesses and fostering worker preparedness in a global market. Since its creation in 2009, the regional cluster, I forgot where is it? RCI, the Regional Cluster Initiative. Sorry. Do-do-do-do-do-do. Here. Since its creation in August 2009, the Regional Cluster Initiative, or RCI, has become the central mechanism for cluster-based efforts in MSP, or Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Minnesota. The purpose of the RIC is to focus and inform regional economic development using clusters as a framework. It aligns MSP regional strategies with national competitiveness, strategies to grow, retain, and attract jobs, as well as create other economic benefits for MSP. The table below shows an overview with key activities. So they just showed activities, but they don't show who's in charge or how many people, what is this organization composed of. I'll just skip here to the lessons learned. The work of RCI and its partners has been a learning process for political and business leaders in MSP. This learning process has helped us define steps in regional cohesion, while the cluster approach is still emerging and being defined in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the state of Minnesota. Implementing a cluster framework has helped the Minnesota economy by providing a common language and understanding about regional competitiveness that enables a more effective dialogue between public and private regional leaders, allowing for identification of targeted regional needs and creation of programs that directly addresses the firm's needs in areas such as workforce and skill development. So mostly they took like seminar, workshop, education approach. So their activities were identifying the key clusters, developing a business plan, and then work with BioAlliance to convene medical devices clusters leaders and identify cluster priorities for action. Conducted CEO to CEO conversations. So it just seems like seminars and summits, basically gatherings. And they talked to the leaders, made a plan, and then I think they followed through with that plan. So let's just see what happened. Trade industry clusters. What do we have here? Hmm, table on, let's see, traded industry clusters in MSP. That's the place. That's Minneapolis, St. Paul. I just want to keep on repeating it so it's not confusing when you re-listen to the video again. So we have the targeted clusters, the medical devices, financial services, distribution services, plastics, analytical instruments, chemical products, metal manufacturing, production technology, information technology, publishing, and printing. So those are their targets. Their emerging clusters of interest are management of companies, biopharmaceuticals, education and knowledge creation, and then other clusters. I guess these are already existing clusters, transportation and logistics, business services, etc. So we have, what is LQ? Location quotient. So I'll just read back a bit to sort of understand this map. Today, this as of 2013, MSP is a broad-based economy that largely reflects the diversity of the United States as a whole. In 2010, the seven-county metro area had a population of 2.8 million, projected to increase to 3.6 million by 2030. The 13-county metropolitan statistical area (MSA) included two Wisconsin counties, had a population of 3.3 million in 2010 with a labor force of 1.8 million. The workforce participation rate is one of the highest in the nation at 73.5%. The economic output from these workers was estimated at, let's say, 200 billion in 2010, which ranks MSP as the 13th largest in the nation. So MSP is also consistently ranked among national leaders in terms of levels of quality of education attained. So basically, they have high education. Over 90% of workers aged 25 and older in the region have at least a high school diploma. In addition, 38% have a bachelor's degree or higher. The relatively high education level of its residents, in combination with regional strengths in higher wage industries, has translated into higher personal incomes for workers in Minneapolis, St. Paul. So in 2010, per capita personal income or PCPI in the region was $46,000. I wish it said, is that per month or per year? The PCPI was approximately 70% higher than the national average of 39,000. However, PCPI growth in MSP has been lagging relative to the nation. A decade earlier, PCPI of MSP was at 23% above the national average. It went down from 23 to 17. So the long-term economic development of the state and MSP has been significant, and strengths have emerged financially and socially beneficial areas. Reflecting the historical development of the state, major clusters in MSP, as identified by employment concentration or location quotient, LQ, are medical, basically reflecting the major clusters are, medical devices, financial devices, etc. that I mentioned earlier. And then see figure 1. The medical devices cluster is the most dominant with 21,000 jobs and employment concentration about 3.75 times higher than the national average in 2010. This cluster has tended to specialize in cardiologic therapies such as pacemakers, with familiar players including Medtronic and Boston Scientific. So these are the companies that deal with the creation of pacemakers. However, it's also begun to include medical technology, innovations in biologics, radiologics, and orthologics. So those are the different businesses. So that's, I'll just skip to the next part here. Top 10 revenue earners. I want to see like their processes. I'm going to go to their table of contents again. Organizational movement activities. Okay, activities is on page 19. I also want to see what their organization is. How is it structured? Organization movement. Okay. So in order to address MS's challenge, professionals, policymakers, and then timeline of their initiatives. I want to see their composition of like what's inside the RCI, the Regional Clusters Initiative. Brookings business plan. Okay, that. The challenge, organizational movement, activities of the regional clusters, urban regional clusters. I guess they just don't say what's inside their group. Okay, we'll check their activities. Yeah, I also don't like the formatting is a bit wonky for me. Like the heading is here at the bottom of the page and then it continues on the next page. Activities of the Regional Cluster Initiative or the RCI. Their purpose is to grow, retain, and attract jobs and other economic benefits in Minneapolis, St. Paul. To accomplish this purpose, the RCI has number one, selected 10 traded clusters on which to concentrate its research, completed 3 cluster studies with graduate students, working in tandem with mayors and representatives of workforce investment boards, initiated outreach to corporate headquarters, engage medical devices cluster leaders in settings priorities for cluster strategy, then fostered competitiveness through ongoing partnerships with the RCM and the greater MSP. So RCM is the regional cluster movement or something like that. And MSP is the Minneapolis St. Paul, the name of the region. So let's see. So from what we can tell, they were created via a grant. The leaders are, I think, some professionals, and most of the the workers are students or kanang volunteers, I think, just like from their description here. So okay, okay. So we have about 10 minutes left. I'll just double check if the outcomes of these initiatives were successful. So I'll just Google, let's see. First one is what is this group called? The OBC, the Oregon Business Council. So let's see, quick search in the news, what happened to them. Let's see, let's look at some news headlines. Led to Oregon State University to lead federal effort. Many Oregon cities and towns say they're short on industrial land. Oregon's semiconductor industry would grow quickly with state investments. Oregon cities lack industrial land, costing them. Kotek County Oregon lack of industrial land. They keep on saying lack of industrial land. Let's look at past projects. Let me double check here. Achievements. See news. Travel organ announces. They don't seem to be in the news anymore. So maybe they have. The website is still up. Oregon business plan. You have one for 2022. Let's see outcomes. Let's see, try outcomes. Organize around policy news, organ strategic plan, organ business council. Is it what? Review. Okay, here's something. Charity Navigator. The OBC's charitable institute shares and supports mission of Oregon Business Council to contribute to Oregon's quality of life and economic prosperity. Rating information. Based on this website, which may or may not be a good source, the charity scores 80%, earning it a 3-star rating if this organization aligns with passions. So apparently they're doing good work, although I can't really find who would review the Oregon Business Council. Guide star profile. So for the most part, seems to be, I guess a good way to put it would be a work in progress. Nothing significantly, what do you call this? Positive with a quick Google search. Let's take a look at the uh, this is the Minneapolis St. Paul Regional Cluster Initiative. Um, any reviews, news, nothing. Images, they because they seem to be existing still. Cluster mapping. Let's see, Universalism, greater MSP home. Okay, let's see. A look at the latest economic development range, luring groups of similar and interrelated businesses. Review from the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, published 2003. It's even older. The report we've seen was from 2013. Okay, nothing. Okay, so there's no, unfortunately, there's no like glowing review, but there's also no um, sort of ridicule or kind of critique of these organizations. Maybe they were able to do what they were supposed to do, or maybe they were just what they call this, similar to what we see here in Cebu and the Philippines, that they were strong at the beginning, they made all these plans, but maybe the plans did not follow through. At least the Oregon Business Council has uh, what do you call this? A website that still works. Let's check. I'll double check their business plan for 2022. See if we can glean anything. 2-page summary for shared prosperity strategy. So the Oregon Business Plan began framing a decade-long strategy aimed at not just prosperity but shared prosperity. This holds that all Oregonians from all backgrounds, communities, locations must have equitable access to goods, jobs, education opportunities, and other resources. Da 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 da. Goals Hello, hello. Badungog ako.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Right.
Sorry, naputo, namatay ang internet sa balay. But anyway, um, so looking at the example of Oregon and MSP, Minneapolis, St. Paul, we can see like the approach of this clustering initiative is through some kind of NGO, usually a combination of like grants or government support funds these organizations. They create business plans. Whether these business plans and initiatives have any kind of positive outcome, it's a question mark. But at the very least, we can see how what are the goals and what is the framework for these different groups. And ultimately, we based on the review by by Motoyama, we can't really copy their framework and like activities one for one, but we can use them as a starting point. The first step, really, for any kind of business plan or economic development plan or policy or program is really reviewing what we have in our local community and yeah, just like hope for the best from there. In Cebu City, I can say from experience that there are since I've gotten here, I got back here in 2019. I've seen a lot of like summits or kind of talks, seminars on what to do with Cebu City, and just based on my experience, I think it makes me feel like more hopeful, more involved, and honestly, I don't think I could join these kinds of summits in Sydney because they're very kind of locals based, and I wasn't really in the loop because I wasn't part of that organization. So, as people in the academe or those interested in the environmental planning, urban planning, and urban design. I think if you join those summits or groups or workshops in your local community, you may have a better understanding of what you need to do for your kind of um, local community or maybe a career in environmental planning or at the very least like for your thesis you might have a good idea of what to do um, for the most part, most of the theses I've seen in the University of San Carlos architecture department are uh, what do you call this? Not so good. So maybe a study of a business plan, the creation of business plan might be something that will be interesting for you. For next week, um, let me see. I'm looking at my notes here. We'll try to tackle. There's so much more theories here. Um, I think I'll just skip. I'll do a quick discussion on urban spatial structures, and then maybe I'll skip the neighborhood economic development, trade comparative advantage, and just go to the like the meat of like analysis, input output analysis, and shift share analysis. If I can understand it, I'll try to discuss about that. Other theories that we might discuss are product cycle theory, opportunities and challenges for region in knowledge economy, and human capital creative class. So these are basically different kinds of readings that you may be able to use in your different classes. But for our course in this sem, we may be able to tackle maybe two or three more before our exam next week. Or otherwise, I might just have it full lecture kay medyo kuwang. There's still a lot of things to talk about. Maybe just make it a bring home exam. So I'll update you next week. The readings should be, I'll share it with you sa Canvas. So hopefully this will be useful to you. So with that, I think we can end our lecture. Okay, wala mag-internet. So I will see you guys next week.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir.
All right. Iggy,
Thank you,
I'll
sir.
share
Right.
the resources lang. All right. Bye-bye.